Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. A huge show for you tonight. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. As the Prime Minister finally fronts Jewish leaders at a synagogue in Melbourne this evening, we'll talk to two Australian Jews who are facing the full horror of terror attacks from Hamas. One has a family member who's been taken hostage. Nobody knows where she is. Another has a family member wounded while fighting back against Hamas on the Gaza border. In some good news, Australian journalist Cheng Lei returned home this afternoon to her family in Melbourne after a 3-year imprisonment in China in a surprise announcement this afternoon. The fallout continues from the Opera House protest, with police forced to set up a new task force given further unauthorised rallies set for the weekend in Sydney. We'll talk to the UK editor of The Spectator magazine. Just how has the rest of the world reacted to the footage of Australians chanting "Gas the Jews" outside our Sydney landmark? And what a contrast in leadership British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has provided the world overnight in a speech that I'll show you shortly. Plus, we'll also be joined by former PM Tony Abbott, the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, and Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie to get the latest on the No campaign and their fight against Anthony Albanese's voice to the Parliament, which we will all vote on in just 3 days. And as he gets set tonight to address 5,000 Jewish faithful at a prayer service in Sydney, Opposition Leader Peter Dutton had this message to the Prime Minister about anyone at Monday's rally here on a visa.
I don't know where the Border Force is looking at whether those people are permanent residents, if they're citizens, if they're visa holders. If they're visa holders, the visa should be cancelled immediately, and the Minister should be taking that action right now, calling for people to be gassed or celebrating the death of women and children is just appalling.
But first, there's really only one way to react to the mass murder of innocents: shock, horror, anger, and a burning desire to see the perpetrators of such evil punished. Anything else, like calls for restraint or hair-splitting about who's really to blame, or business as usual, perhaps from political leaders, not a big concern. Well, that shows a seriously faulty moral compass. Restraint? Well, that's you, Penny Wong. Like splitting hairs? Well, that's coming from far too many in the media who have clearly swallowed the Hamas propaganda in their historical ignorance. And the more or less business as usual response, well, that's the Prime Minister, who can find time to shed a tear in the dirt at Uluru about his voice, but not until late this afternoon unequivocally condemn this hate, as we saw his UK counterpart Rishi Sunak do in a remarkably powerful speech in a London synagogue overnight.
I wanted to come here tonight to stand with you. To stand with you in this hour of grief as we mourn the victims of an utterly abhorrent act of terror. To stand with you in this hour of prayer as we think of those held hostage and your friends and loved ones taking refuge in bomb shelters or risking their lives on the front line. And perhaps above all, I wanted to come here tonight to stand with you in solidarity in Israel's hour of need. As the Prime Minister of this country, I am unequivocal. The people who support Hamas are fully responsible for this appalling attack. They are not militants. They are not freedom fighters. They are terrorists. Their barbaric acts are acts of evil.
In that clear demonstration of what real leadership looks like, the UK Prime Minister outright rejected any attempt at moral equivalence that some in the media are trying to get up, that we have seen from weak politicians here on the left. Greens MPs like Senator Marine Faruqi, who said it was a disgrace for the Australian Parliament to show solidarity with Israel. Or Labor frontbenchers like Tony Burke, who has still failed to condemn the violent hate from the Islamic preacher at an event in his own electorate on Sunday night. But no such weakness from Prime Minister Sunak.
There are not two sides to these events. There is no question of balance. I stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. The United Kingdom stands with Israel against this terrorism today, tomorrow, and always.
And he spoke out powerfully against any attempt to target Jews in Britain.
I say, not here. Not in Britain. Not in our country. Not in this century. My first duty is to protect you. We will not tolerate this hate. We will not tolerate this anti-Semitism. And I promise you, I will stop at nothing to keep you safe.
Here in Melbourne overnight came this terrifying post from the Australian Jewish Association regarding multiple reports, it said, about, and I quote, a carload of Arabs hunting for Jews. And this admission too from the New South Wales Police Acting Commissioner that even though Monday's shameful pro-Hamas, anti-Israel protests in Sydney were not legal, that they were not authorised, it was the police that in fact escorted the crowd from the town hall and down to the steps of the Opera House.
We were better to facilitate that march to the Sydney Opera House. They had a point of destination, undesirable for everyone, how it may have been, but we had no power, if we didn't facilitate that march, to stop people walking down there anyway.
What's worse, arrests look very unlikely.
Identification of the individuals involved in that proved exceptionally difficult at the time, so we are going through an investigative process at the moment, and if we can identify offenders from Monday committing offences, we will take action.
Indeed, it would seem the only person that the police arrested was Mark Spiro, who turned up holding an Israeli flag. And that's why today, in complete damage control and scrambling to look like they were doing something, the New South Wales Police have set up what they're calling a protest task force. Yet with a very large protest set for the weekend, again, unauthorised, you can only imagine the vile hate that will spill out again on the streets of Australia.
At this stage, I would encourage people not to attend that assembly on Sunday that is currently proposed because they do have no protections.
And all this comes with confirmed reports out of Israel of the terrorist depravity that's confronted soldiers and medics today as they reach the dead in communities near the Gaza border. Hundreds of innocent civilians, including women and children, many of them who were raped first, and some who were beheaded, including dozens of babies. And yet here in Australia, seen around the world, was the vision of Australians marching on the Opera House, lit up in the colours of the Israeli flag, screaming, "Gas the Jews, F the Jews."
Where's the Jews? Where's the Jews? Where's the Jews?
Now that's bad enough, but what was almost worse was the reaction of people who should always be clear about whose side they're on. The police who escorted the racist mob to the Opera House. The Labor and Greens MPs have been silent in their condemnation of this anti-Semitic hate. And until Premier Minns finally intervened this morning with an apology to Sydney's Jewish community, the New South Wales Attorney-General, the Police Minister too, well, they seem to think that they've done the right thing, warning the friends of the innocent off the street while making the streets safe instead for the supporters of terrorism. This is developing into a crisis for the Labor Party, but particularly the Albanese government. Having a significant Middle Eastern community in your electorate can't justify silence in the face of evil. It shouldn't warp your perceptions of what Australia's values are or Australia's national interest. Yet the deafening silence of senior ministers Tony Burke and Chris Bowen about the weekend's atrocities, or their mealy-mouthed pleas for the protection of everyone that in practice would only hamper a strong and justified Israeli response, shows how easily principles can be corrupted by squalid politicking and ethnic branch stacking. There was something deeply incongruous about a Prime Minister in the past 24 hours, deeply emotional about how Indigenous Australians might react to a lost referendum, but comparatively detached about the enormity of this massive loss of life from terrorism, or the shame that these protests in Sydney at our iconic Opera House, the shame that that brings to us all. The fact that we still don't have any confirmation from the Prime Minister that the National Security Committee of Cabinet has even met to talk about our security response to any local ramifications of these events, well, that simply staggers me. Or possible global consequences should Hamas develop into a wider war of extermination against Israel. Similarly of concern was the fact that Australia, the staunchest friend of Israel up until the election of the Albanese government, the fact that Australia was absent from a significant joint statement by world leaders expressing solidarity with Israel, issued by the White House, the statement involving the leaders of the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, but not Australia. Does our Prime Minister not believe, as this statement declared, that the terrorist actions of Hamas have no justification, no legitimacy, and must be universally condemned? Does he not want to ensure Israel is able to defend itself? It's hard to imagine that we wouldn't have been asked to support this statement. Hard to imagine we wouldn't have been asked to support it. And it's dreadful to think that the moral confusion of the Labor left might have stopped Australia from doing so. Tonight, the Prime Minister is in Melbourne and he has now visited a synagogue before headlining a Labor fundraiser at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. In Sydney, Peter Dutton will soon speak at a large Jewish event, a prayer service in Sydney. It's in responding to unexpected crises that governments reveal their true mettle. And so far, Labor in Canberra and Sydney are failing us utterly. All right, Olivia Causley is with us in Canberra now, and she has the headlines.
Good evening. Australian journalist Cheng Lei has been released from Chinese detention and is back on home soil. Anthony Albanese says her release follows the completion of judicial processes in China. Cheng spent over 3 years in detention. Her captivity was one of the major sticking points in the bilateral relationship between Beijing and Canberra. Claire O'Neill has batted away coalition concerns that a National Security Committee meeting has not been held over the conflict in Israel.
I was able to have a conversation with an Australian citizen, Cheng Lei, who has arrived safely here in Melbourne and has been reunited with her 2 children and her family.
The issue first bubbled to the surface on Tuesday when Peter Dutton said he found it remarkable that the NSC had not met yet.
It's unbelievable that the National Security Committee hasn't met to talk about our equities in the Middle East, what happens in relation to staff, not just in Israel but in Lebanon, in surrounding areas otherwise, if there's a need for an evacuation, what happens here in terms of the policing effort, the coordination around places where people of Jewish faith are gathering.
Because it is that committee that makes relevant decisions, for example, about getting Australians repatriated home from Israel. We know from the past, in 2006, with the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, that there was threats against the Jewish community here in Australia. And so it should have been immediately clear when these events occurred that the first thing that should have happened was convening the National Security Committee Cabinet, and I just can't believe the Prime Minister hasn't done so.
The government has accused Mr Dutton of just playing politics and say they've been receiving rolling intelligence briefings.
The way that I deal with National Security Committee and national security issues is to take them seriously. You know, we haven't foreshadowed Cheng Lei's return before this. We don't foreshadow when NSC meets.
The Home Affairs Minister would not confirm or deny whether the meeting had been held.
I don't believe it's appropriate for me to talk about when the National Security Committee of Cabinet meets. Peter Dutton would know as a Home Affairs Minister that we are lucky to have some of the most professional and skilled security agencies in the world. I take their advice on how to manage these issues, not the Leader of the Opposition.
The opposition says they want to see more effort on home soil to protect Jewish communities.
Unfortunately, it is consistent with reports we've had to police here in Melbourne overnight of a group of young men driving around a car in obviously Jewish areas of Melbourne and saying that they were looking for Jews and looking to kill Jews. That's exactly what the Jewish community fears from these events, and they are unfortunately right to fear that. We must make sure that our police, that our security and our intelligence agencies are doing everything they can to make sure that none of the violence that we've seen in Israel is repeated here in Australia.
Australian government-assisted flights for citizens in Israel will begin from Friday.
We understand that many Australians are experiencing difficulties with delays and cancellations with commercial flights. For Australians who do not already have plans to leave through commercial options, Australian government-assisted departure flights will depart from Friday.
The government is considering all options to provide the 10,000 Australians in Israel with an avenue to get home. It follows a conversation between Transport Minister Catherine King and Qantas and Virgin CEOs Vanessa Hudson and Jane Herdlicker about working with DFAT to bring citizens home. Qantas has announced plans for a board renewal after a spate of controversies plagued the airline.
One of the really urgent priorities of government here is to make sure that we are protecting Australians as best we can who are in Israel. If you have any relatives in Israel and they would like to return to Australia, make sure they have registered with the embassy in Israel.
Chairman Richard Goyder will retire next year, ahead of the airline's annual general meeting. Both Jacqueline Hay and Maxine Brenner have also announced their intention to step down from the board in February. Elections will be held at this year's AGM to fill vacant positions.
All right, there's a lot to get through. Let's get moving. Daily Telegraph's national editor James Murray joins me now. And the Australian's media writer Sophie Ellsworth. Welcome to you both. James, let's just recap, because I think it's so important after listening to that speech from Rishi Sunak last night. I think the failure of leadership in Australia, we had those terrible pro-Hamas rallies in Australia, first on Sunday night, then, of course, on Monday, facilitated by the police, led to the Opera House by the police, even though they were not authorised. We saw the concern in Melbourne last night that there were people targeting Jewish kids, cars of Arabs, we're told. We've got members of parliament, we've got sporting stars trying to equate somehow Hamas terrorists with Ukrainian freedom fighters. How on earth did a place like Australia get to here?
Peter, it is all so morally bankrupt that it's very hard to even begin to describe what has gone on here. Remember, what we have seen here in Sydney the last few days has been a situation where basically the police decide who gets to run the streets by the weight of numbers and whether or not there's a threat that they will be violent. I interviewed Mark Spiro yesterday. He said that when he was arrested by the police and detained briefly, they said they were concerned about their own safety, i.e. they didn't want there to be any conflict because they didn't want to get hurt. I mean, is this what the police are there for? Do we want to live, Peter, in a situation, in a city, in a country where the weight of numbers and violence decides who owns the streets? Because that's where we're going. And that was the really disturbing thing. You know, and you mentioned that thing going around social media in Melbourne. Here in Sydney, there's been vision of a carload of young Jewish teens with an Israeli flag getting set upon and yelled at by what appeared to be a carload of Arab Australians. It is a terrible thing that we're going down this, and Rishi Sunak set exactly the right tone. He gave a masterclass in leadership. There is no moral equivalency here, and Jewish people deserve to be safe. End of story.
We're going to cross the UK in a moment and speak to the editor of The Spectator on that speech and how Australia has been seen from afar. Let's go, though, to those comments from the Prime Minister today. Sophie, he's accused the Greens, fair enough, but the Coalition, not fair enough, of trying to politicise what's happened in Israel. Now, all Peter Dutton's demanded is that anyone at the rally on Monday night who's not here as a permanent Australian, not a permanent citizen, perhaps on a visa, send them home. Well, that's a no-brainer. And he's asking why on earth has National Security Committee Why has the NSC not met, given the ramifications for attacks here in Australia and all of this Jewish hate now spilling out onto the streets, but also what might happen if Hamas takes this further than what we've just seen over the last few days? I might add too, when MH17 came down and also during the Lint siege in Sydney, NSC under Tony Abbott met 2 or 3 times a day. A day. I am concerned that this government is just not up to the job.
Well, Peter, you make some very valid points there, and I think the opposition leader is well within his rights to ask these questions. You know, as Australians, we want to know what is going on overseas in Israel at the moment is nothing short of absolutely horrifying. And Peter Dutton is well within his rights to ask these questions, Peter. But I get really tired when I hear politicians say, oh, they're playing politics. That just goes... I just think that's a silly argument. Let's get down to what's happening here and why haven't they met and find out and make sure it happens. And I think that is questions that should be made public, and the Australian public should know what is going on, given there's so many Australians over there in Israel at the moment, completely and utterly terrified, Peter, with what is unfolding, and looks like this will continue for some weeks, who knows, months yet.
And of course, we had that statement out of the White House, James, a joint statement involving a number of countries, but Australia, we were a notable absent.
Well, we were a notable absence, and in fact, around the world, Peter, they're looking at social media and seeing vision of what happened in front of the Opera House the other night, our most iconic building that's, you know, an architectural ambassador to the world. And this is the same government, too, by the way, I just remind everybody, that likes to go around saying, oh, well, if we vote no to the voice, the world will be watching, they'll think we're a terrible country, you know, and yet I think the world is actually looking at what's going on in Sydney, in Melbourne, and as you point out, Peter, the conspicuous absence of our name from that joint declaration. It's just shocking, and I just feel like the Albanese government has been caught so flat-footed on this. They had a whole plan about, you know, getting the voice through the last week here, that they took their eye well off the ball with this. And it's just, you know, it's been terrible for everybody concerned, not the least the Jewish community, which has now had to live in fear, which has been told they can't go to commemorate their dead in Israel. I mean, thank God they've got this event going on now in the eastern suburbs, but it's interesting that all the ministers are down at some fundraiser in Melbourne rather than going to, you know, join in solidarity.
I might add there, though, I will stick up the Prime Minister on this point. He has attended a synagogue in Melbourne late this afternoon. He is now at that fundraiser, as you say. I should have vision of the fundraiser. I should also have vision of Peter Dutton at that large event in Sydney. I'll play that when I have it. But just on the media, Sophie, this moral equivalence, in part, I think it's historical ignorance and lack of understanding. I mean, Hamas is a proscribed terror organisation in Australia. In England, the BBC, they refused to call them a terror organisation. They called them militants. Now, that's obscene. But the other night here, the ABC gave a platform to one of the organisers of an anti-Semitic protest, enable that person to say why they didn't like the Israel flag to be there in solidarity on the Opera House. Now, I have a real problem with that too.
Well, Peter, it's pretty disgraceful, but I'm not surprised from the ABC. But just going back to what you mentioned at the start there with the BBC, I mean, that's absolutely disgraceful as well. As you said, Hamas is deemed a terrorist organisation here in Australia and should be described as that. I don't really understand why media are holding back on this. They are what they are. Say what they are. The Australian public, when they're listening to the media report on the events happening overseas, they should report it factually, and that is a fact. But again, we see the media, who are skewed a certain way, trying to kind of protect that, Peter, which is just absurd.
Hey, look, just before we go, Sophie, that very surprise announcement that Cheng Lei is now home in Australia. I understand you've had contact with the family.
very brief contact this afternoon, Peter. I mean, what an amazing story. Cheng Lei's home after 3 years behind bars in Beijing. I spoke to her partner, Nick Coyle. He lives in Port Moresby. I spoke to him very briefly on the phone this afternoon. He had just landed in Melbourne. He was obviously just totally overwhelmed with what was unfolding, and he was on his way to see Cheng Lei after 3 years. He still hadn't met with her. He was going to see her and be reunited with her and her 2 children and her family here in Melbourne. I mean, I will say, Peter, for this case, the Prime Minister and Penny Wong, absolute kudos to them. This was such a delicate situation, and to bring Cheng Lei home after what seemed like was a never-ending tale of horror of her remaining behind bars, a remarkable story, and hopefully we'll hear from her in the coming days or weeks when she's prepared to speak to Australians about her amazing return home.
Yes, I echo the credit there to the Prime Minister and to Penny Wong and, of course, our DFAT officials in Beijing. James and Sophie, thank you. Thank you. All right, let's go now to the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, gave a powerful speech at a synagogue, as I mentioned, overnight, where he said his government support of Israel is unequivocal. Joining me now to discuss this, Editor-in-Chief of The Spectator magazine, Fraser Nelson, who joins us now from the UK. Fraser, thank you for your time. I mean, I listened to this speech last night. I played it again a couple of times today. It's brought tears to my eyes because he has said what we have been willing our Australian politicians here to say, but that they haven't said. How has this been received and what's been the reaction? I understand you too have had some pretty disgraceful anti-Semitic protests in the UK as well.
Yes, unfortunately, the anti-Semitic protests are taking place not just in the UK, but all over Europe. And it's in a city like London, it's so multicultural that you will find supporters of almost any cause. But outside the Israeli embassy, there was absolutely appalling scenes, which are really sort of chants that you hear. The number of people who are actually supporting Hamas in this country has taken a lot of people by surprise. Now, Rishi Sunak's speech, you're right, it was very robust and gave no quarter. But that wasn't actually unusual in Britain because the Labour Party is doing exactly the same, the opposition. There isn't really any political controversy about denouncing this, about standing completely by Israel at a time where, Hamas are going in there and they're executing women, children, babies, we heard yesterday as well. There isn't really any room for doubt, I think, as to what we see before our eyes. So we did see the Prime Minister there, but we also saw David Lammy, Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary. Nobody is really... You've got a couple of sort of crank politicians who are equivocating, but other than that, there is no real doubt or even variance in the language and the sentiments coming from all British political parties.
Yes, I think Labor has learned its lesson in the UK after the Jeremy Corbyn episode, but not so here in Australia. We've had some issues with some frontbenchers who have not denounced some of the hate preachers that we've seen here in Australia. But just when we're talking protests, you will have seen those scenes outside the Opera House in Sydney on Monday night. In particular, comments, chants like "gas the Jews" and other things I can't repeat on television. How's that been portrayed overseas?
Well, in a fairly competitive field, I think what's happened outside the Opera House was the worst display of anti-Semitism. You can get some protests where they're shouting "Free Palestine," pro-Hamas, and all the rest of it. That is rather different to shouting "Gas the Jews." I think the Australian protests are the only ones in the world where that slogan has been audible from a crowd. And that has really focused minds on what we're seeing here. I mean, this is a repeat of the 1930s, a repeat of the genocidal logic which so terrified the world, and a repeat of things which, frankly, a lot of people thought and hoped they would never see again. So there have been, everywhere you go, there have been deeply unpleasant Hamas protests, but none of them as shocking as what we saw in Sydney.
Yeah, it brought to mind the speech recently by your Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who said, we must be on guard in the West about migrant populations who come to our countries and refuse to integrate in any way. I'm not saying assimilate, saying keep, their traditions and their culture, but very much in our case become Australian. She said that's not always the case, and it's certainly, as we see playing out negatively too in the United Kingdom. That's also a debate we've got to have, isn't it?
Oh, sure, it's a debate, and it's a debate we've had for a while, that yes, you can have a multi-faith country. Britain's perhaps the most successful multi-faith democracy in Europe. You can have a multiracial society. I mean, Britain, through empire, is the original multiracial state. But a multicultural society is one that will always struggle to integrate. And that is a direction where those who believe in one country and social cohesion have been focusing away from multiculturalism and towards more one common set of cultural values. But that said, it would be a mistake to look at a group full of psychopaths protesting in a street in Sydney or in London or anywhere else and think that they speak for the Muslim population. I mean, there are millions of Muslims in Britain who would be appalled at what's happening with Hamas. The problem for the Muslim community is that they're rather let down by their spokesman. There is no kind of Muslim pope, as it were. It's difficult to speak for any community, but the Muslims are particularly badly served, I think, by pressure groups who are far too politicized, far more politicized than your average British Muslim, and will just struggle to condemn the attacks. In Britain, for example, we've got the Muslim Council of Britain has issued a statement which didn't really issue a word of condemnation. That does not reflect, I think, what most British Muslims are thinking.
Fraser Nelson, thank you. I'll be catching up with you in Australia next week. We'll see you then. Right before we go, as I said there, I'll see him next week. There's a whole series of events with Fraser Nelson in Australia, including one in Melbourne at the Robert Menzies Institute dinner. Gala dinner. He's the keynote speaker. He'll be talking about the state of modern conservatism. Now, I'll declare I'm on the board of that institute. It's a not-for-profit at the University of Melbourne, but if you'd like to go, if you can attend, we'd love to have your company. All right. Coming up, we'll hear from 2 Australian Jews about the profound toll these terror attacks in Israel are having on their families here in Australia and their reaction to the protest. We'll also hear from former PM Tony Abbott, Andrew Hastie, the Defence Shadow Minister, Shadow Treasurer too, Angus Taylor, on the Voice referendum, only 3 days to go. Coming up, we'll be joined by Tony Abbott, Andrew Hastie, Angus Taylor to get the latest on the Voice from Western Australia. But first, I want to talk to some victims of all this horror. Both victims are on the streets of Israel, of course, but people impacted by what we're seeing in Sydney and Melbourne. Joining me now for the human impact of all of this on Australian Jewry, a proud Australian Jews, Dr. Benny Monheit and Tamir Aloni. Benny and Tamir, I hope I didn't botch that for you, Benny.
No, that's fine.
Before we get into your personal stories, what's your reaction to what you saw play out in Sydney, first on Sunday night and then that horrific pro-Hamas rally at the Sydney Opera House, and concerns that I know are being felt in the Melbourne Jewish community as well?
I was shocked. I didn't believe it. And then I got a bit scared, really, because this is what other Australians are saying about Jews. It makes me feel less secure. And I'm really worried about what this means for our Western democracy in really, not only in Australia, but we're seeing the same in Europe and even in America, that they've forgotten about the Holocaust and what Nazis did. This is almost a mirror image of that, and we know where this goes. We've seen it before.
Tamira, I had the same reaction, that how could, in my lifetime, in your lifetime, how could humanity appear to have forgotten what we know occurred so monstrously in history? What's been your reaction and that of your family as you watch this play out?
Look, as a grandson of a Holocaust survivor, this is a very personal, affecting moment in history. We really feel the anti-Semitism is rising everywhere at the moment, and it's scaring the Jewish community in terms of their safety, even in Australia.
Benny, tell me about your family member. I understand someone you love in Israel has been taken hostage. What can you tell us?
I got a text message from one of my cousins who lives in the southern part of Israel to say that Margalit has been abducted and is in Gaza. They didn't have any other information. I tried to ring Margalit. I tried her Facebook page. There is no answer. I rang other members of the family. They don't know exactly what happened. No one has been able to get in touch or give me any extra information. So there is almost sort of like disbelief there. When I spoke to them yesterday, there was still this feeling of this isn't real, you know. So I haven't really got any information at all, which makes it worse.
What can you tell us about Margalit? What was she doing? You know, did she have family?
She is a 74-year-old woman who was born in Israel, worked on the kibbutz there. It's a grape-growing area, brought up her family and kids. And she was a lovely family member. She she's an artist, and we sort of saw her when we visited Israel every few years. Every 2 or 3 years we go there. But why would anyone want to kidnap a 73-year-old grandmother? I mean, it's just horrible.
And what about your family?
So the initial raid that occurred on Saturday morning was centred around the villages in the south of Israel. My close family, my cousins, live in a place called En Abso. It's in the south of Israel. My cousin, who was called up very early to say there's something going on, you need to go to the front gate of the village. He very soon encountered unspecified, but a large number of Hamas operatives that were there. They had started to fire on him. He fired back. There was a gun battle that ensued. He was able to repel that entire Hamas cell that was there trying to invade his particular village. By doing so,
wow.
that one village was the one that was spared out of all of them that wasn't overrun by Hamas. He sustained a bullet wound to his shoulder. When he was evacuated by his brother, my other cousin, who lives also at this same village, they were then ambushed by another cell that was operating in a very close by area. The car was covered in bullets. He sustained 2 further gunshots to his buttocks, but he was okay. They managed to then go back, retreat into the village, got first aid, and eventually, hours later, he got to hospital to be taken care of. But he's okay.
I want just quickly, if you can, Tamir, people to understand that, you know, Israel's a small country of 9 million people. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have a massive standing army like the United States or elsewhere. And that over the last 48, 72 hours, when they've called in the reservists, the 400,000 reservists now, to literally go in the front line, we're talking about people who work in professions, young people that are literally picking up machine guns, aren't they, now to defend their country? Absolutely.
I mean, with a country of 9 million people, 400,000 adult men, mostly men, but is a huge toll on the workforce, on everything. Essentially, Israel at the moment is in a state of war, and therefore it's not operating as per normal. And all these people have dropped literally everything. Many of them have not even been asked to come. They've literally just gone, okay, there's a war, we've seen, we've heard. We are going to defend our nation with everything that we have. And irrespective of what their professional background is, as soon as they put that uniform on, it's about the country.
I know you were feeling shock and anger and disbelief about what's happened, not just in Israel, but what you've seen here in Australia. I say this on behalf of the non-Jewish Australian population. So many of us, we are angered by what we've seen here in Australia too, and we are shamed by what has happened, and we stand with you. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Look, in some scenes that should hearten you all too. We've got some footage there, aerial footage of what's happened in Sydney tonight. There's been 5,000 people turn up at a prayer vigil for Jewish Australians, for Israel. Peter Dutton, as I said, will speak there shortly, but they are heartening scenes to see that show of strength. All right, after the break, Tony Abbott, Angus Taylor, Andrew Hastie and The Voice. All right, let's cross now to Western Australia, to the town of Nannup, a farming and timber milling community a couple of 100 kilometres south of Perth. Joining me now, former Prime Minister, my former boss too, Tony Abbott, Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie. Gentlemen, thank you. Well, thank you for getting off your bikes, firstly, and for joining me tonight. We'll get to the reason why you've been riding for charity a little bit later. But Tony Abbott, if I can start with you, I need your reaction, please, to what we've seen play out in Israel over the weekend, but more particularly, the fallout on the streets of Sydney and things now happening in Melbourne too, where anti-Jew protesters have caused such mayhem.
Well, as for the events in Israel, Peter, it was a vicious attack on democracy, a vicious attack on civilians that should be universally condemned. As for what we saw in Sydney, frankly, it was absolutely un-Australian, and people who come to live in this country really must leave ancient hatreds behind. Final point I want to make is that the police have got to be far tougher on this kind of thing. Any protest that is likely to involve massive race hate, as this one did, should be dispersed. I mean, the police were more than capable of breaking up anti-lockdown protests, if necessary, with rubber bullets and tear gas. Why weren't they prepared to disperse this protest with the same kind of vigour? Our streets must be owned by the police and by our citizens, not by violent, hate-filled protesters.
Andrew, as someone who's worn a uniform to fight against terrorism overseas, what do you make of comments from Greens politicians, sporting stars, and I think weak responses from some Labor frontbenchers too, that basically have this moral equivalency between Hamas and Ukrainian freedom fighters?
I think it's terrible, Peter. I think this isn't a time for silence. It's not a time for equivocation. It's very clear what happened in Israel over the weekend was murder. The slaughter of the elderly, the slaughter of women and children, the rape of women. Any person in the right mind should be able to condemn that. I condemn it. I stand with Israel. And I think what we've seen on the Labor front bench particularly is troubling, that they've been so mealy-mouthed about something that's so clear. It's an act of evil and should be condemned as such.
Angus, the Prime Minister has criticised the coalition, says you're playing politics with this issue. He, of course, has been around the country on The Voice. He's not had any events or been in contact with the Jewish community. He has, this afternoon, though, visited a synagogue. John Howard has said that the government is pussyfooting around here. Peter Dutton says if there's anyone in that crowd on Monday night that isn't an Australian citizen, cancel their visa and send them home. Why do you think the government has been slow in its response?
Well, that's a very good question, Peter, because this was an evil and malicious terrorist attack. And the truth is that as far as we know, the government hasn't even had a National Security Committee meeting to deal with it. Now, whenever we see a significant event, particularly a terrorist attack like this, that has implications for Australia, and this clearly does, even just looking at the protests in recent days, you would expect a government to have a meeting of the National Security Committee and to work through how to make sure we get the right response to this. We are not seeing that from this government, and I think there are some very, very serious questions that Anthony Albanese needs to answer.
If I can go to you, Andrew Hastie, now on The Voice. I mean, pollsters tell me one of the things that really showed up in their research was when those WA laws came into play and people could see the ramifications of basically separatism in relation to landowners and farmers, and that turned the tide for many people. What's the feeling now in WA 3 days out from the vote?
Yeah, Peter, the Aboriginal and cultural heritage laws which were brought in by WA Labor were a blatant attack on property rights, and that activated the population here. People were very tuned in to what the voice might do long before the public arguments were really engaged. I said WA Labor basically ran a scare campaign for the no campaign in the voice by introducing those laws. What we're seeing here in WA is deep scepticism of this project, a personal project by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. There is a lot of concern that it's divisive, but to link it back to the cultural and heritage laws, are they concerned that this voice would have a veto say or right over a lot of areas of our life that we share together? And that's why people are trending towards the no vote.
Angus, pollsters Redbridge say that one of the reasons why the yes vote has plummeted and also why the undecideds are not falling the yes's way is the government's being in part punished here because they seem to have dropped the ball on all the other issues that people care about. The voice seems to be an obsession of the Prime Minister while they're struggling to pay their bills, while they're concerned about the economy more broadly.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Peter. And the Prime Minister is distracted. Yes, of course, Indigenous disadvantage, any disadvantage is something we want to alleviate. But the truth is this Prime Minister is obsessed. And right now we're seeing serious cost of living pressures on families across Australia. Indeed, we see just today the IMF telling us that we have the highest level of mortgage stress across the developed world here in Australia. And this Prime Minister can only talk about his Canberra-based voice. So he's distracted. His priorities are not the priorities of hard-working Australians, Peter, and I think that's really showing.
All right, we'll get to polypetal in a moment, Tony, but just your last word on the voice as Australians get ready to vote, if they haven't voted already. 3.5 million have on Saturday.
Well, Peter, I just think that this voice is wrong in principle. It would be bad in practice. And the more the public are thinking about it, and they're thinking through the ramifications of giving some people a special say over how we govern based on ancestry, the less they like it, and the more it seems to be completely at odds with what we've always wanted to do in this country, which is basically to say, if you're having a go and you want to join Team Australia, you're a first-class citizen, regardless of how long you or your ancestors have been here.
Andrew Hastie, last word from you just quickly on the polypetal ride. I know Angus Taylor's taken on the mantle of being the polypetal boss from Tony Abbott, but they're raising money for a charity that you care about as a former soldier. Tell us, well, two questions actually. Tell us about why the charity is so important to you, but also, how's the old bloke in the middle? Can he still keep up?
Yeah, we're supporting Wandering Warriors this year, which is a charity set up to help veterans transition from the ADF into civilian life by giving them educational opportunities. We've had a number of veterans go to University of Queensland, do their MBA program, and we want to build this charity up and expand their programs. And we've got 2 Rhodes Scholars here. They know the value of education, so it's great to have them on the ride supporting this. Does he still have it? Yes, he does. This guy's a diesel. He can go. Angus is a Kelpie. He'll gallop all day. But this bloke, Tony, he's got staying power.
You're being very kind, Andrew.
There you go. He'll be happy about that. Gentlemen, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Tony Abbott, Andrew Hastie and Angus Taylor. All right, quick break. After break, Kel Richards. All right, welcome back, Kel Richards. Not a lot of time. You take it away.
OK, firstly, is Hamas a militant group or a terrorist group? Well, militant means engaged in warfare. It's related to the word military, and it means declared open warfare against military targets. Terrorism, on the other hand, means using violent intimidation, for political purposes. I mean, terror is extreme fear, using extreme fear for political purposes. So we have to say Hamas are terrorists. They are not militants. Any journalist who calls them militants is wrong, and they are getting it wrong. For Saturday, the word referendum. Now, referendum means to refer, and it actually comes from a Latin word, so it comes from the same verb as the verb to refer, and it means to refer to a higher authority. In our democracy, it means referring to the highest authority, the Australian people. The Australian people are never wrong. Peter.
I'm sorry, we've run out of time. We've got more we'll get to next week, Kel. I'm sure you understand. Thanks very much, as always. Thank you for your company. I know some of this stuff is hard to watch. I've got some terrific messages, though. I know you are behind Israel and our Jewish community here in Australia, so thank you. All right, very close to The Voice, 2 days to go from tomorrow. Up next, Andrew Bolt.